And before I plunge into summarizing, right, I want a one chapter treatment of sociology of science. This is the best. Rodney Stark's book, For the Glory of God. He's discussing how monotheism, not how the Bible, but how monotheism created modern science. So this is about 90 pages, which is twice the length of my chapter, but science to Reformation. But his focus is not on Reformation per se, but on God, the Bible's God. Why belief? Not that there is a God, he doesn't argue that there is a God. He argues that the belief in Trinitarian God created modern science. Now, he used to be head of the sociology in State University in Washington, not DC, Washington State. But then now he's a professor at Baylor University.
Yeah, Baylor!
Yeah.
My sister's graduate.
Oh, good. Now, if you want a one book treatment of the subject of the Bible's relationship to the rise of natural science, Peter Harrison's book is the best. It's called The Bible, Protestantism, and the Rise of Natural Science. Now, neither of these two men are Christian. Peter Harrison was head of the sociology in Bond University in Australia. There are some from Australia here, there's one or two people. Now he is head of a think tank. He spent 7 years in Europe studying the lives of all the private letters, diaries of all the founders of modern science to understand the question why science was born in Europe and why scientific revolution took off in the 17th century. So this is a lot more detailed and in some ways better work than Rodney Stark, which is studying the impact of the Bible Reformation on the rise of natural science. The third book, which is dealing not with the sociology of science, but with the philosophy of science. The first two are discussing sociology of science, and Willis Glover, he is from Mercer University, somewhere in Pennsylvania, now retired. His book, Biblical Origins of Modern Secular Culture, an essay in the interpretation of Western history. This is, there must be better books, but this is the one that really helped me understand the philosophy of science, why the biblical philosophy. So he is not in any way criticizing Roman Catholicism, because he's pointing out that it is actually the Roman Catholic theology in the 13th and 14th century that laid the philosophical foundations of science. Nor is Rodney Stark criticizing the Roman Catholic Church, because he looks at 52 of the pioneers of modern science and finds that 26 of them were Protestants, 26 of them were Catholics, but all of that, even the Counter-Reformation had happened in the Catholic Church, so even the Catholics were really looking at the Bible and at creation biblically. So they shared the same perspective which gave birth to science. So Willis Glover book you need to read 2 or 3 times because it is a difficult book to read, but if you have the patience to persevere, this is a very good book. Unfortunately, there is no picture on internet as yet of the book, and I've lost my copy of the book, so I couldn't photograph it. But hopefully it's somewhere there, I'll find it. Now, so these are, other than my own chapter, which is about half the size of Rodney Stark's chapter, these are 3 important resources that I would recommend for you to really grasp the relationship of the Bible to science. If you have not read, well, it is Rodney Stark's book, and if any of you are interested in it, you can take a look, but first I must put my name on it so it doesn't disappear. But Anandit has read this book, I haven't. This is Nancy Piercy and Charles Texton. Both of them are my friends. Nancy is, of course, a wonderful researcher and writer. Texton is a scientist, a chemist, a PhD, soul of science. The publisher will cross with publisher. So this is, if I haven't read it, but those who have, they say it's a very good book. So this is just some of the resources if you want to pursue the subject in detail. But let me, those who will not be pursuing in detail, but just want to understand enough this week. Let's begin with a simple question. What is the first book on science ever written? With the scientists most of the non-Christians will say that Genesis is the most anti-scientific book. But most people would say that, in fact, Aristotle's Physics is the first book of science. Now, Aristotle didn't write the book. He gave many lectures on what were put together as physics. And there is dispute about which lectures are really his lectures and which are not his lectures. But Aristotle's Physics. Now, when did Aristotle die? Long time ago, 322 years before Christ, BC. 322. So this is collection of his lectures, which are called Physics. Today, not one physicist anywhere in the world believes one sentence of the book. Now, Christian priests, these would be, at that time, Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox were all one. So Christian priests who spoke Greek, that would be, Greek was spoken in lots of parts of the world, including in what is now Turkey. They were copying all the manuscripts available, including Aristotle, and then Islam took over many of those nations, and Islam acquired Christian scholars who knew Aristotle and Plato. So then the Muslims forced these people to become Christian and translate the Greek learning into Arabic. So Aristotle, Plato entered the Arabic Muslim thought, and then it came back into Europe because as Muslims took over parts of southern Europe and Spain, etc., they translated these Greek books, which had been translated into Arabic, back into Latin. So Europe learned some of Aristotle. It had a few copies of few of the Aristotle's book. Aristotle was able to write a lot because King Philip of Macedonia, father of Alexander the Great, hired Aristotle to tutor his son to make Alexander a philosopher king. So because Aristotle had the state patronage, he was able to write a lot. Most of us have to, in order to write, most of us have to choose to be poor. You couldn't, if you travel, you get paid. If you sit and write, you don't get paid. The publishers survive on the basis of what the writers do, but the writers unless you happen to have a television show in America or a radio show, then you can sell a lot of your books. But most writers have to choose to be poor in order to write. But Aristotle had the advantage of state patronage, so he was able to write a lot. Socrates couldn't write anything. Plato was able to write some, but because he was the other way of writing is to be in jail like Paul was. If you are in jail, then you get a lot of time to write. So, this is writing serious non-fiction, which in days when there is no. Okay, so Aristotle, 322 years before Christ, does these lectures, which is collected as a book called Physics. Did then Greece export science?
No.
Did Greece export science? Well, when Greek power disintegrated, the center of intellectual life became Egypt, Alexandria. A lot of wonderful things happened because that's where Alexandria, as a port city in northern Egypt, was the center of intellectual life. Then Rome became the center. And wonderful things were happening in China. Those of you who are interested in looking at missionaries to China, here is a book on science and technology, the ancient genius of China, of what was happening in China, that you are welcome to look at after I put my name on the book. You can borrow it and look at it. So wonderful things were happening in India, in China, in Egypt, in Greece, in Africa, etc. But when was the first scientific society was born?
Oxford
Our first scientific university.
or Cambridge?
Universities existed in Cambridge, though it was not the first. First scientific lab was established in Cambridge, that's true, but that's 1851. But first society which is dedicated to studying science, promoting science. Well, it's 1666 in London, what is called the Royal Society of Science. That is the first scientific institution. I got it right. No, one more time. Okay. So that is Thomas Spart's book, The History of the Royal Society of London for the Improving of Natural Knowledge. This is the first institutionalization of science, first society. So there were individual brilliant geniuses, but scientists coming together to pursue knowledge does not happen for 1700 years or 1800 years after Aristotle. That's what raises the question for this week. Why did scientific revolution take off in the 16th, 17th century? Why couldn't science take off anywhere else in the world? So yesterday, Sanandit was describing a number of scientists, particularly the science behind medicine, as they are establishing scientific medicine. They're in France, they're in Germany, they're in England. That's where scientific medicine is developing, that's where science is developing. Why didn't this happen in Egypt or in China or in India or in medieval? Why didn't it happen in 15th century? Alexander the Great had taken Greek learning all over the world, including to India. Rome had taken Roman learning and power all over the world. So, Roman Empire, Greek Empire, Muslim Empire had spread from Mecca, Medina, all the way to Istanbul.
Was it because of like their beliefs and worldview? I guess talked about like a fatalist worldview, where if you're born into that, then there's no way of getting out of it.
Thank you. So the answer, your answer was leaning towards political power and patronage. Your answer is leaning towards intellectual factors in a culture that either hinder or promote science. And the political power is important, economic power and political power is important, but it is the intellectual factors, more than intellectual factors, also the cultural and religious factors that we will look at. To just give a little hint right now, which we will pursue perhaps tomorrow. Yesterday, Anand kept talking about one scientist who was writing his discoveries to the Royal Society of Science, and they mocked at him because he didn't know Latin. Who was he?
Leeuwenhoek.
Okay. So, the significance of that fact, why is he able to do intellectual work without knowing Latin?
Because you're studying the Bible promotes the literacy because you want to know what you're...
Thank you.
Yeah, translators.
Bible translations. Bible translators were the greatest revolutionaries of the last 1,000 years, and they continue to be the greatest revolutionaries. And your university plays a very important role in promoting Bible translation all over the world. And the significance of that we will look at perhaps tomorrow when we consider the priesthood of all believers, because when we are talking about the Reformation, we are talking about priesthood of all believers and what impact that has on the birth and development of science. But I won't make that a focus right now, but just a little hint that that here is a person who doesn't know English, but he's doing good science. He's able to write to the Royal Society of Science and persist in it because he has a ability that he can write in Dutch or write in English and not bother with Latin. Because what he's interested in not knowing languages, but knowing the truth. And that's a revolution that Luther has begun. All of European languages, except Italian, exist because of Bible translators. So Martin Luther creates a German language. Now, a version of English had existed because Wycliffe had already translated the Bible into English, but it was banned. His Bible was banned. The printing didn't exist when Wycliffe translated his Bible, which was about 60, 70 years before Gutenberg's printing press. So Tyndale, William Tyndale, he goes from England to Wittenberg to translate the Bible into English. So Tyndale Bible, New Testament initially, but then most of the Bible, is the basis for modern English language which we are speaking right now. Finland was never a nation. Finland was a colony of Sweden for centuries, then a colony of Russia for centuries. But Michael Agricola comes from Finland to Wittenberg in Germany under Luther to translate the Bible into Finnish language, which creates the Finnish consciousness of Finland as a nation, etc. So all the European languages, Portuguese is one language which has very little direct impact of the Bible, because it's a fusion of Italian and Gallic language. But most of the languages of Europe and most of the languages of India and most of the languages of Africa exist as literary language because of Reformation and Bible translation, because of the doctrine of priesthood of all believers. And what that has to do with the birth of a scientific revolution, we will consider tomorrow. But today, the central has already done a book on physics. But Bertrand Russell, British atheist, celebrated atheist, he says that Aristotle's physics is not science, it is philosophy. Aristotle's physics is not science, it is philosophy. Why? He is using logic to know truth. So I mentioned that he says if you go climb up a cliff, drop two balls, let's say one is stone, another is wood. So the stone ball, they're same size, but the stone ball is twice as heavy. Which one will fall faster? He said that heavier ball will fall faster. If it's twice as heavy, it will fall twice as fast. So this is before 330 years before Christ. For 1800 years, no one tested it. Why not? Because it was logical. In fact, the Muslim intellectuals, Avicenna and Averroes, they say that if observation contradicts logic, then there is something wrong with observation. So, he's climbed the Leaning Tower of Pisa, he's dropped two balls, cannonballs, one is heavier than the other. Both fall at the same time. So he says, well, maybe there's something wrong with my observation, so let me get a dozen people and let them watch. Maybe let me get someone else. Well, both the balls still fall at the same time. So yeah, well, maybe you are men and men can't see things properly, so let's get some women to observe. Balls still fall at the same time. So, well, okay, let's climb a ship mast and drop the two balls from there. So he repeats the experiment many times. Balls always fall at the same time. So, are you going to believe your logic or are you going to believe the observation? You believe the observation. There's something wrong with logic. You need a new logic to understand why the heavy ball falls at the same time as the light ball. So why does it? That's what Isaac Newton explains through his law of gravitation, that the speed of fall has nothing to do with the weight of the object falling. It has to do with the gravitational pull. Why doesn't the apple go up instead of coming down? Because the earth is pulling it down. Gravitational force of the earth is pulling it down. Same gravitational pull is being exerted on both the objects, heavy ball and the light ball. Therefore, both fall at the same time. Now, if the heavy ball fell on your head, the impact would be bigger than falling on the light ball falling on your head. The size is the same, the speed is the same, but the impact is different. But that's a different matter. The speed of the fall and the impact of the fall are two different things. So, what has happened? The basic method of science has changed between Aristotle and Isaac Newton. What has changed? Observation has been put above logic. That's what has changed. Now, why is observation put above logic? This has not happened anywhere else in the world. This has happened only in Europe and only at that time. That's why scientific revolution is happening. And this has to do with, Newton is born in 1643. 1643 is when Harvard University has adopted truth. What is that? Veritas is Latin for truth. Veritas means truth. So Harvard University was already founded in 1636. 1643, it adopted that shield that the university exists for truth. Why? Because God wants all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. So you have to go to the University of the Nations to know the truth. We will come back to it. This is the older version of that seal that we will look at. But I was actually, I was going here. Francis Bacon, is that? Yes. So, Francis Bacon has written his book. He is called, what is he called? The father of modern science. So Aristotle is not called the father of science. But Francis Bacon, he is called the father of modern science because he is proposing novum organum, which is new instrument, advancement of learning and new instrument. So Aristotle's instrument of knowing truth is logic. Francis Bacon's instrument of knowing truth is observation. Now, Anand gave 6, 7, or 9 points with it. Then you begin with a question, you have a hypothesis, you have experimentation, observation, then you have a thesis, and then you have experimentations, refinement of thesis, etc. But to summarize all of that is the choice between putting observation above logic. Aristotle has put logic above observation. Truth is known through logic. A new science is putting observation, which includes experimentation. You take a telescope, take a microscope, or build a spaceship, go up, or build a submarine, go down, whatever. You observe facts. So, why did this change happen is what we are going to talk about. Now, how much time do I have? Sorry? Okay. Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back to understand why this change happened from logic to observation and what role did the Bible play. Thank you.
So far, my reasons for